Good evening. Good to see everyone this evening. I know they're having the Sunday deal out at the Castlers too for the teens, so hope that goes well. We've been doing characters in here. Started talking about David last Sunday. Want to talk about David a little bit. He's quite an amazing character in Scripture. David had two different opportunities to kill Saul in 1 Samuel 24 and 1 Samuel 26. And both times he chose not to do it. Actually, in 1 Samuel 26, Abashi, which is one of the mighty men of David, said, "Let me kill him. I'll drive the spear through him once. I won't do it again." The spear was by Saul's head. The interesting thing about both these accounts is that both these times they kind of used God against David. They said, this is what God's done. God's give you to his hand. God's give you the deliverance. All you got to do is take it. This is God's will. And I've always really looked at these because I think sometimes in life we not understand God's will is not necessarily what we think God's will is, right? It's God's will to do it, but David saw a greater will with God, and that was that I don't kill the Lord's anointed in cold blood. And David even brings that up on the second account. He says, he will die in battle, but it won't be by my hand. In other words, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to raise up my hand against the Lord's anointed. And I think that really shows patience on David's part. David's fleeing for his life. Saul's after his life. David's fleeing. It would have been so much easier on David if he just would have killed Saul, took the throne. He wouldn't have had to run. He would have been where he needed to be, but yet David left room for God. And I just think there's such a lesson in that. But probably one of the greatest things about David was his relationship that he had with Jonathan. Jonathan was the son of Saul and in line to the throne. Jonathan would have taken the throne of Israel if that had progressed from Saul. But in 1 Samuel 18, which is right after David slays Goliath, is where that really falls in the scripture. It came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. There's been a lot spoken about this relationship between David and Jonathan, but it appears to be a relationship of two kindred spirits. They were very close to one another, brothers, if you would think of it that way. Jonathan loved him as himself, and Saul took him that day, did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. It was really significant because Jonathan was showing David that you're going to take the kingship. I'm giving it to you. That was a really big thing. Now, why Jonathan did that, there's been a lot of debate about that. The relationship between David and Jonathan has always been a point of debate. But Jonathan understood that David would take that role, and he gave it to him willingly. That was quite interesting because, like I said, he would have been in line to the throne. But this relationship between David and Jonathan, it became much more than that, as Jonathan spared the life of David by letting him know the intentions of Saul on a couple of occasions that he did that. And in one of those occasions, in 1 Samuel 20, David told Jonathan, he said, "If I'm still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." He wanted his lineage preserved, and he wanted to be preserved. If you really look at it, he believed that he would be with David after David took the throne, but he would be beside David, not on the throne. But he makes this covenant, and he says, "Don't you kill me." In other words, "I've spared you from my father, but don't you kill me." And then he also says, "Make a covenant that you won't cut off my descendants forever." This is a really big covenant because when kings took over reign and power, they would kill all the descendants of the previous king because they didn't want any heirs to the throne. And that was his intent, and that's why Jonathan says that. Don't cut off my house forever. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies." Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. And so David makes this covenant with Jonathan that he won't cut his house off forever. And that's really going to come into play later on in their relationship. And it tells you David's commitment to that covenant. 1 Samuel 23 is the last time David and Jonathan in Scripture meet. Now David became aware that Saul had come out to seek his life. While David was in the wilderness of Ziph and Haresh, and Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David Haresh and encouraged him in God. And thus he said to him, do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. Sometimes we miss that in the story. Jonathan thought he would still be in that kingdom. Jonathan, in that covenant, Jonathan really was looking towards himself. Don't kill me, don't cut me off forever. You know, I know you're going to get this. I know Saul's going to perish, but I'll be next to you, Jonathan said. And Saul, my father, knows that also. So Saul had already come to the conclusion. Of course, if you read back a little bit where he spared his life, Saul had told David, you know, surely you're going to be king over Israel. Saul had come to that conclusion that God had chosen him to be king and that nothing would stand in the way. Jonathan had come to that conclusion also. Jonathan said, I'll be beside you in the kingdom. In other words, be your right-hand man, more what he was thinking. I won't be the king, but I'll be your right-hand man. And Saul knows that too, which is really interesting because he's saying Saul knows that I'm not going to ascend to the throne. And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. And David stayed at Haresh while Jonathan went to his house. So the covenant between Jonathan and David was maybe a little more complicated sometimes than what we think. David will die on Mount Gilboa. Saul will commit suicide. Jonathan will die. Jonathan will be slain. And when that word comes to David in 2 Samuel 1, he has the we call it the prayer of the bow, or the lament of the bow. And in that lament, he says, how have the mighty fallen in the midst of battle? Jonathan is slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me is more wonderful than the love of women. And David had a lot of women, right? So he was saying basically that our friendship, our love we have for one another is a selfless love. It's more powerful than the love of women. They loved each other like brothers. Their souls were knit, the scripture says. And so David laments over the death of Jonathan. But yet there's this covenant that David needs to fulfill. And I think that's where the story gets kind of interesting, because there's a man, David will seek it out. David is going to seek out, and actually in 2 Samuel 4, it says that one of the sons, which had been 5 years old, of Jonathan, one of Jonathan's sons, because Jonathan had wives and concubines, Jonathan was power too, one of his sons that was 5 years old, it says in 2 Samuel 4, when the house of Saul fell and everybody was being killed, his nursemaid took him and fled, and she fell, and he became lame in both his feet. And so David now is in power. David has the kingdom, and Israel's united under the throne of David for the first time probably in the history of Israel. It's united. And David remembers the covenant that he made with Jonathan to never cut off his descendants forever. And David says, is there yet anyone left in the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant in the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. And they called him to David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. And the king said, is there not yet anyone in the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in both feet, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face. I skipped a few verses in there. You can read that for yourself. And prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth? And he said, here's your servant. So David seeks out Mephibosheth, who interestingly is lame both feet. And I know you don't see the significance of that maybe, but to be lame was to kind of be cursed by God. It was unclean. And generally people that were lame or disfigured or had any kind of uncleanliness were not allowed in the presence of the king, number one. It just didn't happen. They weren't allowed into the king's court. You had to be unblemished to be in the court of the king. So for him to be lame in both feet, unable to walk, that's significant in the story. And yet David here wants to show the kindness to him because that's the last of the household of Saul. It's Jonathan's son, Saul's grandson. And so David brings him in. He says, do not fear, because Mephibosheth was fearful for his life. He thought, well, I'm the last one of the descendants, and David will just kill me. And that way there won't be anybody to come to the throne in Saul's stead. But David said, do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land your grandfather saw, and you shall eat at my table regularly. That's a huge thing. The king's sons ate at the table. Those who were in the king's favor ate at the table. And he prostrated himself and said, what is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me? And then the king called Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring him the produce, so that your master's grandson may have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly. You know, this has always really spoke to me, this passage, because, we're Mephibosheth, I mean, that's who we are. This is a parallel story. You don't see it that way. You think this is just a story about David and Jonathan and Mephibosheth, but what you don't understand in the story is that we're Mephibosheth. We're the ones who aren't supposed to be in the king's presence. We're the Gentiles. We're those who are excluded from Israel. We're not supposed to be in the presence of the king. We have no business there. We're not of Israel. But God, through the mercy of Christ, he allows the Gentiles to approach. He allows us to be part of that. We've been grafted into that family. We're not supposed to be in God's house. We're the unclean, aren't we? We're the unclean. In Jesus' time, you and I couldn't have gone to the temple. We couldn't even went into the outer courts. That would have been punishable by death. For us to have went into the temple courts would have been punishable by death because we were the unclean. That's what got Saul in trouble was, that was accusation. He brought a Gentile into the temple. That was the whole accusation against Paul in the book of Acts. You and I are Mephibosheth. We're crippled. We're sinners. We're unworthy to be in the presence of the king. We're unclean. And yet God says, you can come into my presence. You can come into my court. The Hebrew writer says you can come to the throne of God with confidence. And you and I, due to the grace of God, are able to swing our poor crippled feet under the table of the king. You see, there's a huge story in this. Why can we do that? Because God made the covenant, didn't he? God made the covenant, and he said all nations will be blessed. That was the covenant of God, the promise of God. All nations will be blessed. So we're Mephibosheth. We're the ones who don't deserve it. We're the ones who need to fall on our face before the king and say, why do you regard a dead dog like me? I'm not worthy to even be here. And yet God says, get up, set up my table, right? I'm giving you your inheritance because even though you're not worthy, even though you don't deserve it, even though you should die, I'm going to keep my covenant. And when you really think about this story, it really has a lot of power because that's who we are. And sometimes we miss that in the story. And every time I read this story, I think I'm the one who's swinging my poor crippled feet under the king's table. It's only by the grace of God that I'm able to do that. I think it's powerful. The story of Jonathan and David is unlike any covenant relationship between two individuals in the entire Bible. For him to give up the throne, give up his birthright, give up what he should have had because he loved David to the extent and left room for God's will because he knew God had put David to be king in his stead. This story is just unbelievable in its magnitude of covenant and promise and love, and it just speaks parallel to what you and I have in our faith today about the love Jesus had for us, the covenant promises, the ability for us to go and sit at the king's table it all just astounds me. So this evening I just wanted to share that part of David's story with you, the part of David's story about the covenant. Before we get into David's transgression, before we get into what David did wrong and how David failed, you have to understand David was a man after God's own heart. David did tremendously great things, even though David also failed, as we fail. David did great things, and one of the greatest things I think David did in the Bible is he honored his covenant that he made with Jonathan, who he loved as himself. I just think it's a tremendous story in the Scripture, and I hope that you enjoy the thought of it. If we can assist you in any way this evening, won't you let it be known while we stand?